She boarded the plane with the kind of quiet grace that drew glances without asking for them, her silver hair catching the cabin light, her polished cane resting against the seat like a loyal companion, and her deep brown skin telling a lifetime's worth of stories before she even spoke. To some, she was just another passenger in first class, but to one man in the next seat, she was an easy target for the kind of contempt that hides behind smirks and subtle jabs. He didn't know that every calculated shove of her handbag, every stolen inch of space, every silent humiliation was a step toward something he could not see coming. By the time the wheels touched down, the man who thought he owned the row would find himself at the center of a moment he'd never forget. If you want to see exactly how that happened and why his world changed before he even stood up from his seat, make sure you like this video, subscribe for more stories like this, and tell me in the comments what you think is about to happen and where you're watching from. Horace Minton stepped into the first-class cabin, his gaze sweeping over the seats before lingering on Lucinda Braxton, an elderly black woman sitting neatly with her cane resting against the seat. He deliberately brushed his shoulder against the cane, causing it to tilt to one side. While stowing his luggage, Horace shoved his suitcase down hard, forcing her small handbag further inside, then slammed the overhead bin shut with enough force to make the entire row shake. The aircraft breathed around them in a steady hum while passengers filtered in, a flock of muted colors and hurried motions, and Horace moved through that current as if the aisle were paved for him alone, the rubber soles of his shoes biting the carpet with a possessive rhythm. He reached his row and let the edge of his coat graze Lucinda's armrest without apology, a feather-like trespass that signaled intention more than clumsiness, then sat with a deliberate sprawl that pushed his knee into territory he had not been offered. Lucinda adjusted the angle of her cane with a quiet, practiced motion, the polished wood catching a thin ribbon of cabin light, and she held her posture with the composure of someone accustomed to turning small collisions into nothing more than air, the kind of grace that denies an audience to pettiness. Horace glanced at the attendants as if they were a backdrop and not professionals, and his cheek settled into the hint of a smirk, the expression of a man who reads silence as permission. The cabin around them settled. Overhead bins thudded shut in a staggered cadence, and seat belts clicked like small locks, sealing a shared container of decisions and temperaments. Horace tugged his belt tight with a snap, then placed his phone screen down as if he were burying evidence of patience, and he leaned back so the leather breathed under his shoulders, letting out a slow exhale that spread into the space between them. He adjusted the armrest with a knuckle, tested the resistance of the shared boundary, and let his elbow rest in a way that claimed more than half the bar, a calculated encroachment wrapped in the costume of fatigue. Lucinda opened a slim notebook with edges smoothed by habit, the paper dense enough to drink ink without bleeding, and her pen traced careful lines that spoke a private language of order, checks, and small confirmations. She kept her gaze forward, attentive to the choreography of the safety checks without fixating on any single face, and her stillness functioned like a quiet room tucked inside a noisy terminal, an interior that refused to echo someone else's disorder. The engines deepened their tone, and the cabin light cooled by a single temperature, the kind of shift that signals departure to those who fly often, and Horace tapped his foot to test how much vibration would reach her ankle through the floor, noting the way her hand steadied the notebook without conceding even a millimeter of space. He reached for the air nozzle and twisted it toward himself, then angled it half a degree toward her to pull a stray draft across her shoulder, a petty weather system disguised as casual preference, and when a thread of her scarf fluttered, he let the corner of his mouth rise again. The attendant nearby completed a latch check and moved on, and Horace took the opportunity to nudge his carry-on under the seat with the toe of his shoe until it pressed into the tip of her sensible flats, a brief contact that made a statement while masquerading as limited legroom. Lucinda repositioned her feet with the grace of someone resettling a chess piece. No clatter, no shake, only a tidy redraw of borders that refused to escalate the moment into spectacle. The pushback began, and the aircraft's body translated intention into motion, a slow rearward glide that hushed the cabin further, and Horace used the deceleration to let his shoulder drift an inch closer, measuring whether a brush would be chalked up to turbulence. He withdrew before contact, saving the touch like a coin for later, and instead returned to the overhead space with a feigned memory lapse, unfastening the bin and shifting his suitcase just enough to compress her handbag deeper, the leather dimpling at the corners, as if the bag were swallowing its own breath. The bin shut again with a practiced thud that sent a faint shiver through the panel, and Horace watched the vibration die along the seam, curious how many small disturbances it would take to draw even a glance. Lucinda finally looked up, not at him, but at the lighted seatbelt sign, confirming something routine and unremarkable. And in that refusal to engage, she placed him outside her priorities, a location that aggravated him more than protest might have. The taxi began, and the cabin gained that smooth skating sensation of measured speed, and Horace tested the recline, pressing back half an inch before stopping, an experiment he filed away for future use. He took a paper napkin from the side pocket, folded it into a line, and balanced it on the ridge of the armrest as if marking a border, then carelessly brushed it against her sleeve so the fibers left a faint dusting of white. She brushed the lint away with 2 gentle taps and returned the napkin to the pocket between them, a gesture so polite it felt like a reprimand softened into etiquette. The safety demonstration concluded, trays locked, seats upright, and the runway gathered itself under their wheels with a long, consequent roar, and Horace let the acceleration push him back while he planted his knee into the soft partition between seats, using inertia as his accomplice. As the cabin stabilized at climb, he loosened the shoulder of his jacket and let the fabric break the neat line of her space, then corrected it slowly as if sparing her an inconvenience. Outside the window, the sun cast a soft glow over the wing, but inside, Horace's presence eclipsed the sense of calm most passengers were settling into. He shifted again, pretending to find a comfortable position, each movement nudging her further toward the confines of her seat. Lucinda kept her shoulders squared, her gaze fixed on the distant horizon beyond the wingtip, though the subtle tension in her hands betrayed her awareness of his intrusion. The flight attendants moved through the aisle with trays and clipboards, checking passenger counts and confirming service preferences. But Horace sat back with the smug stillness of someone who believed rules of courtesy applied to everyone but him. His foot began a slow, deliberate tap against the carpet, sending a faint vibration into her side of the row. It was not loud enough to draw attention from anyone else, but persistent enough to remind her of his proximity. When she reached for the in-flight magazine in the seat pocket ahead, he leaned forward at the same moment, his arm crossing just inches from her hand, blocking her access until she withdrew and folded her hands neatly in her lap. A few rows ahead, the clink of glassware signaled the start of beverage service, and Horace seized the moment to lean back further, tilting his head toward the aisle but letting his shoulder edge even more into her personal space. Lucinda adjusted her scarf and exhaled slowly, the only outward sign of response, before settling her attention on the faint pattern of the seat fabric in front of her. The space between them felt tighter with every minute, not because the seats had moved, but because Horace's slow encroachments had shifted the invisible borders in his favor. He rested one ankle across his opposite knee, a maneuver that extended his foot diagonally into the narrow space where her feet had been. The angle forced her to draw her legs in further, her knees now brushing the smooth plastic side panel of the cabin. Horace smoothed his trouser leg with one hand, a small, almost smug gesture of comfort that contrasted with her contained posture. When the beverage cart reached their row, the attendant leaned in to place a glass of water on Lucinda's tray, and Horace used the opportunity to pivot his torso toward the window, his elbow grazing the side of her arm as if the movement had been unavoidable. The glass trembled slightly on her tray but did not spill, and she steadied it with 2 fingers before returning her hand to her lap. Horace reclined half an inch more, testing how far the seat could give without drawing notice, the movement subtle but enough to tighten the already narrow gap between their bodies. His arm along the rest no longer simply brushed hers. It lingered there, a deliberate fixture. Lucinda did not lean away, but her stillness was no longer the stillness of ease. It had the rigid quality of someone holding ground. Outside, clouds stretched in a quilted pattern beneath them, the serene view at odds with the undercurrent of silent conflict in the row. Horace adjusted the overhead air vent, letting the cool draft fall not just on his face, but angling it so the edge of it brushed the side of her neck. The temperature shift was minor but noticeable, and he sat back with the faintest tilt of his head as if enjoying the effect. She reached up and redirected the vent without looking at him, the motion smooth, controlled, and final. For a few seconds, neither of them moved, the tension locked in place like an unspoken truce. He unwrapped slowly, letting the layers of foil crumple onto the tray table, the metallic rustle carrying over the steady drone of flight. Lucinda adjusted her position toward the window, but there was no escaping the heavy aroma, which clung to the air like an unwelcome guest. Horace placed the sandwich on a napkin so close to the dividing armrest that the corner of the napkin hung over into her side. Without taking a bite, he leaned back, letting the smell settle before lifting it again, his hands moving with a casual precision that made clear he was aware of the intrusion. The first bite was taken with exaggerated enjoyment, his chewing slow and deliberate, and the occasional audible smacking sound breaking the fragile piece of the roe. Between bites, he reached into the bag again for a handful of chips, the brittle snap echoing softly in the cabin. Crumbs fell onto his lap, and rather than brushing them away discreetly, he swept them toward the floor where they landed in the narrow space between his shoes and hers. Lucinda kept her eyes fixed on the seat back ahead, her face unreadable, though her fingers tightened slightly over the fabric of her scarf. When Horace finished the sandwich, he crumpled the foil into a dense ball, pressing it together with his palms before placing it on the edge of her tray table space, as if absent-mindedly forgetting where the division lay. He then removed his shoes with an unhurried motion, sliding them neatly under his seat, but extending his sock-covered foot outward until it brushed the side of her shoe. He didn't withdraw immediately, instead letting the contact linger before he shifted slightly, planting his foot so that the toe remained angled toward her space. The warmth of the cabin seemed to grow heavier, the air tinged not only with the lingering smell of his meal, but with the quiet persistence of his physical presence. He began fidgeting with the in-flight magazine, flipping pages too quickly for actual reading, the edge of the paper occasionally brushing her arm. Each time she adjusted her position, he adjusted his as well, maintaining a closeness that disregarded any notion of personal boundaries. A flight attendant passed by, offering refreshments, and Lucinda declined with a polite tilt of her head, her voice low and steady, while Horace accepted another drink. When it arrived, he set it down hard enough on his tray for the ice to rattle against the glass, sending a faint spray of condensation onto her sleeve. He murmured something to himself, too soft to be heard, before taking a long sip and setting the glass dangerously close to her side of the tray. The seatbelt sign flickered on briefly as the plane hit a patch of light turbulence, and Horace used the moment to shift further into her space under the guise of steadying himself. His elbow pressed firmly against the armrest, forcing her to lean even closer to the window. Once the turbulence passed, he did not reclaim his original position, but instead remained in the space he had taken. He opened a small pack of nuts from the seat pocket, the tearing sound quick and sharp, and began eating them one by one with the kind of slow deliberation that made each motion noticeable. Occasionally, he would flick an empty shell into the napkin on his tray, the sound faint but persistent, like a metronome keeping pace with his encroachment. Lucinda's composure held, her posture as steady as it had been when the flight began, but the small adjustments in her breathing and the subtle shift of her knees inward betrayed the mounting discomfort. Horace leaned forward to retrieve something from his bag under the seat, deliberately brushing his shoulder against her arm before sitting back. The contact was brief yet unmistakable, a silent assertion that he could cross into her space whenever he pleased. He pulled out a pen and began tapping it against the tray table, each tap perfectly spaced, not loud enough to draw attention from anyone else, but constant enough to register in her awareness. The sound became part of the cabin's background noise, inseparable from the hum of the engines, yet impossible to ignore. The ice in his drink melted slowly, the waterline rising toward the rim, and he nudged the glass even closer to the edge of her tray space, its position a small but deliberate provocation. When the attendant came to collect service items, Lucinda handed over her empty water glass immediately, her hand steady, while Horace took his time returning his, pretending to take one last sip before releasing it. With a casual glance toward the overhead bins, he rose slightly from his seat, pretending to check the storage above. In one smooth motion, he reached for the bin directly over Lucinda's head, unlatched it with a soft click, and swung the door upward. Her neatly folded shawl lay on top of a small tote bag, placed there earlier with care, its fabric still aligned at precise angles. Without asking or even acknowledging her presence, Horace reached in, lifted the shawl with one hand, and let it drape across the empty seat in the row across the aisle, leaving it there as though it no longer belonged with her. He then shifted her tote to one side, tilting it slightly to wedge his own bag into the space she had kept organized. The edge of his duffel pressed into her tote, compressing its shape until the seams strained faintly. He adjusted his bag twice, as if trying to maximize the intrusion, before finally stepping back and letting the bin door fall shut with a deliberate firmness. Sliding back into his seat, he kept his expression neutral, but there was a faint upward curve at the corner of his mouth, a tell that his action had been as intentional as every other gesture since boarding. Lucinda, still facing forward, did not rise to retrieve her shawl. Instead, she placed her hands gently on her lap, her fingers overlapping in a way that suggested quiet calculation rather than defeat. Horace reached down for the in-flight magazine, flipping it open to the route map at the back. With an elbow perched squarely on the armrest, he allowed the magazine to extend slightly into her space, the corner pressing against her arm whenever he shifted the page. He traced a finger along the map lines as if following a route, the slow drag of his fingertip leaving the impression that the act was more for show than interest. After a few minutes, he closed the magazine with a thud and dropped it back into the pocket, letting the impact rattle the plastic slightly. The aircraft hit a light shudder of turbulence, enough to make the drink in the row ahead ripple in its cup. Horace used the moment to lean sharply backward, pressing his seat into a reclined position so abruptly that it jarred the narrow space Lucinda occupied. The movement caused her small carry-on under the seat to slide forward a few inches, but she reached down calmly, realigned it, and then returned to her previous upright posture. The brief contact of her arm brushing the seat side panel was all Horace seemed to need to reignite his quiet campaign. He reached under his own seat, tugged his bag free, and placed it on the floor so that it extended into the narrow strip where her feet rested. The move was subtle enough to seem like a matter of convenience to a casual observer, yet it cut into her legroom with a finality that could not be mistaken. Lucinda adjusted by shifting her ankles closer together, her shoes now angled slightly toward the cabin wall. Horace crossed his legs at the knee, his upper foot tilting outward so the sole nearly grazed her calf. For the next several minutes, he busied himself with his phone, scrolling with one hand while the other idly traced the zipper pull on his jacket. When the turbulence eased, a flight attendant passed by to check on passengers, and Horace took the opportunity to unlatch the overhead bin again under the pretense of retrieving something else. This time, he slid Lucinda's tote even further into the back corner of the compartment, making it less accessible from her seat, before pulling out a small neck pillow from his own bag. He shut the bin with another sharp motion, resettled into his seat, and inflated the pillow with 3 deliberate breaths, the sound faint but steady. As the cabin lights dimmed slightly in preparation for rest, the shadowed space between them seemed even narrower. Horace tilted his head to one side, rested it against the inflated pillow, and allowed his elbow to slide just far enough over the armrest to press into her sleeve. He didn't move it away even after the initial contact, as if marking the shared boundary once again. The flight attendants began moving through with water refills, and Lucinda accepted a cup with a steady hand, sipping once before setting it down. Horace declined service, choosing instead to fold his arms and stretch his legs into the limited floor space, as if testing just how far he could extend without brushing her shoes again. For a time, neither of them moved more than a few inches, the air between them thick with the unspoken acknowledgement of what he had done. The hum of the engines filled every pause, but under that sound, the steady, deliberate theft of space continued in increments so small they might have gone unnoticed by anyone not experiencing them firsthand. The aisle narrowed as the attendants stopped beside them, one leaning forward to place her tray on the lowered table in front of her. Before she could set her drink and utensils in place, Horace slid his own tray forward, positioning it at an angle so that the edge protruded over the invisible line dividing their seats. It jutted into her space just enough that she could not fully lower her own without maneuvering around it. His expression was neutral, eyes on the entree being handed to him, but the placement of his tray was deliberate, a silent blockade that forced her to shift her meal awkwardly to the side. She adjusted with care, arranging the small dishes in a tighter formation than the narrow tray was designed for. When the attendant asked if they needed anything else, Horace leaned back slightly, his elbow pushing further onto the shared armrest as though sealing his control over the space. He took his time peeling back the foil on his entree, letting the sound crackle in the quiet between them. Every so often, he would set his fork down with a soft but deliberate clink, each noise sharp enough to pierce the low hum of the engines. Lucinda kept her eyes on her plate, eating slowly, her shoulders straight despite the cramped angle she was forced into. Midway through the meal, Horace began adjusting the overhead air vent again. He reached up, turned it toward himself, then twisted it just enough for the edge of the airflow to spill onto her side. The draft lifted a loose strand of her hair, and for a moment, the faint movement broke the stillness of her composure. She reached up and redirected the vent without meeting his gaze, her hand steady, her posture unbroken. Horace's lips pressed together in something just short of a smile, and he returned to his meal, spearing each bite with deliberate slowness. When he reached for his drink, he placed it down on the tray so near the boundary line that condensation beaded on the surface and rolled toward her plate. She adjusted her utensils to avoid the spreading moisture, her movements efficient but not rushed. Once the main course was cleared, the attendants brought coffee and tea. Lucinda accepted a cup of tea with quiet thanks, resting it near the top of her tray. Horace declined, instead using the lull in service to slide his tray table backward into its locked position. In doing so, he leaned across slightly, brushing the edge of his arm against hers before settling back. With her tray still open, she sipped her tea slowly, each motion deliberate. The attendants returned to collect trays, and as Lucinda reached to pass hers forward, Horace lifted his knee slightly, creating a barrier between her and the aisle. She had to shift in her seat to navigate around it, and though the movement was brief, it interrupted the smooth exchange she had intended. After the trays were cleared, the cabin lights dimmed again for rest, but Horace's interruptions didn't cease. He reached up to the reading light controls, switching hers on for a moment before turning it off, then adjusting his own to a low glow that cast a faint glare across her lap. When she folded her hands to rest, he changed the angle of his seat, leaning back just far enough that his shoulder pressed against the armrest in a way that reduced her space even further. Minutes passed in silence, punctuated only by the occasional cough or rustle of blankets from other rows. Then Horace reached for the seat back in front of him, unlatched his tray table again, and began wiping it with a napkin from his earlier meal. His movements were slow, methodical, and positioned so close to the shared armrest that his elbow grazed her forearm each time he extended his reach. She did not flinch, but her hands shifted slightly in her lap, a subtle repositioning that allowed her to keep her balance without yielding more space. After finishing his unnecessary cleaning, he left the napkin folded on the tray and let it hang over the side toward her. When he closed the tray table, it brushed lightly against her knee, another intrusion masked as coincidence. He began by pulling a tissue from the pocket of his jacket and wiping his mouth in a slow, exaggerated motion, then folding the tissue loosely before placing it on the shared armrest. The tissue, slightly crumpled and marked from use, lay there as though it belonged equally to both sides. When Lucinda did not react, he casually pushed it a few inches toward her side with the back of his fingers, the motion so casual it could be mistaken for distraction. After a pause, he retrieved it again and dropped it into the seat pocket in front of her instead of his own, the soft whisper of the paper sliding against fabric, making the act unmistakable. She did not remove it. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap, her chin slightly lifted, her gaze on the darkened aisle where a single attendant moved quietly toward the galley. Horace leaned back, adjusting his cap lower over his eyes, but the tilt of his head allowed him to keep her in his peripheral vision. His smirk was faint but visible in the dim light, the kind of expression meant only for the person sitting inches away. When the captain's voice crackled briefly over the intercom with an update on their progress, Horace used the distraction to shift again, this time resting his forearm along the full length of the armrest until the back of his hand touched her sleeve. The contact was featherlight, but it stayed there, the heat of skin passing through the thin layers of fabric between them. Lucinda did not move away, but she also did not lean toward the window, forcing him to hold the position in a silent standoff. The pressure built not from force, but from duration, each second drawing out the question of who would yield first. Eventually, he lifted his arm, only to place it back a moment later in the same position, as though nothing had happened. Minutes passed in this quiet duel until he broke it by leaning forward, reaching down into his carry-on, and pulling out a glossy magazine. Instead of reading, he began flipping pages rapidly, the edges brushing against her arm on every turn. The light from his reading lamp reflected briefly on the glossy paper, sending a faint glare toward her lap before vanishing again. She adjusted her scarf once, tucking it neatly into place, her hands moving with deliberate precision, as though reminding herself that her space was still hers, however reduced. Horace noticed the movement and paused his page turning, letting the magazine rest half open on his knee. He then reached for the blanket provided by the airline, shook it out with a flourish, and let the corner drape just over her side of the armrest, as though the extra fabric were a gift he had no reason to reclaim. The faint brush of the blanket against her sleeve was constant now, a manufactured intimacy that required her to either accept it or move away. She chose neither, remaining still as the second stretched. Horace shifted the blanket slightly, enough to make it clear that its placement was intentional, and then settled back again, his body angled slightly toward her. The crew passed through quietly, checking for passengers needing anything before they dimmed the lights further. But he made no request, content instead to sit in the shared silence and let the discomfort work its way through. When the seatbelt sign came on again for a minor bout of turbulence, Horace seized the opportunity to slide his foot forward until it rested against the side of her shoe. The contact was again light, but he kept it there, the message unmistakable. She moved her foot an inch, re-establishing the border, but he shifted his again to close the gap. This time, she did not adjust. Instead, she simply kept her foot where it was, and the turbulence masked the faint tension of two shoes pressed together under the cover of darkness. When the seatbelt sign flickered on again for a minor adjustment in altitude, Lucinda reached down to the small personal bag she kept under the seat, sliding it toward her with an unhurried motion. She unzipped it just enough to retrieve a thin, flat case of brushed metal, no larger than a paperback, its surface etched with an intricate seal that caught the faint glow from the aisle. Holding it in her lap, she ran her thumb over the embossed design as if confirming its integrity, then opened it with a quiet click. Inside were several compartments, each fitted precisely with items of specific purpose. A compact digital gauge, a slim inspection stylus, and several silver foil labels bearing serial numbers, and a holographic emblem of the Federal Aviation Administration. Horace's eyes were closed, but the small shift of his head toward her suggested that he sensed movement. Without glancing at him, Lucinda removed the stylus and balanced it across her fingers, its tip glinting briefly before she lowered it to the base of the shared armrest. In a single smooth motion, she traced a tiny mark along the underside, an inspector's code, invisible from above but permanently affixed. She replaced the stylus in its slot and withdrew one of the foil labels, pressing it discreetly against the inner seam where the tray table met the seatback ahead of her. The label bonded instantly, its hologram reflecting a muted rainbow before vanishing into the shadowed space. A flight attendant passed by on her return to the galley, glancing briefly at the pair, but noting nothing unusual. Lucinda closed the metal case, rotated it once in her hands as though weighing it, then slid it back into her bag with the same unhurried precision she had used to retrieve it. Horace opened his eyes just enough to catch the last motion. his brow furrowing slightly at the glimpse of the object before she zipped her bag shut. She reached forward to the seatback pocket and pulled out the safety information card, studying it for a few moments as though reviewing the illustrations, then placed it back with equal care. Her movements were quiet but purposeful, each one controlled in a way that contrasted sharply with his earlier, careless encroachments. Horace adjusted his position, sitting more upright now, and glanced down at the armrest where she had rested the case moments before. If he expected to see evidence of what she had done, there was nothing obvious to find, only the familiar smooth surface. She folded her hands again, eyes returning to the aisle, watching the attendants prepare for another round of cabin checks. A subtle shift had occurred, not visible to anyone beyond their row, but present in the air between them. Lucinda's silence had not been passive. It had been a gathering of time and precision. And now, though Horace still occupied too much space, the current had changed direction. The faintest curve touched the corner of her mouth, a smile without warmth but rich with knowledge. Outside, the night clouds drifted in slow layers, the wing lights casting long, pale reflections across their surfaces. Inside, the temperature felt unchanged, but for the first time since boarding, Horace's posture lacked the easy sprawl of ownership. He shifted his weight from one hip to the other, the blanket sliding back fully onto his side, his elbow no longer holding the armrest in an unbroken claim. Lucinda adjusted her position not to retreat, but to sit squarely forward, her shoulders parallel to the aisle, her presence once again centered in the space that was hers by right. Lucinda remained still for a time, her eyes resting on the seam where the wall curved into the ceiling, her breathing even, her hands folded with a composure that seemed unshakable. Then, without haste, she reached up to the overhead bin directly above their seats. The latch clicked open, and the door swung upward in the muted cabin light. From inside, she withdrew a slim, hard-sided clipboard encased in black leather, its edges reinforced with metal corners, the surface stamped with a gold-embossed seal of the Federal Aviation Administration. The gesture was calm, deliberate, and precise, not the hurried movement of a passenger retrieving a personal item. She placed the clipboard on her lap and unfastened the latch, revealing neatly organized sheets of technical diagrams, each page showing detailed schematics of the aircraft's cabin interior, annotated with fine red lines and handwritten notes in a steady, practiced hand. Alongside the papers sat a small digital device, no larger than a calculator, its screen currently dark, but its keypad worn from use. Lucinda adjusted the angle of the reading light above her so it fell directly onto the pages, illuminating the FAA seal on each diagram and the inspection codes printed at the bottom. Horace watched from the corner of his eye, his earlier confidence faltering as he recognized the nature of what she held. His gaze lingered on the official markings, the precision of the notes, the authority implied in every line of the documents. Lucinda lifted one page from a stack, studied it briefly, then made a notation in the margin with a pen she had retrieved from the spine of the clipboard. She did not rush. Each stroke was measured, her penmanship neat and unbroken, as though the cabin around her was merely an extension of her workspace. The attendant nearest to them paused in the aisle, her eyes catching the seal on the papers, and she gave a brief nod of acknowledgement before continuing her walk toward the galley. The exchange was wordless but carried weight, a silent confirmation of status that did not need explanation. Horace shifted in his seat, his knee no longer pressing toward hers, his arm drawing back from the shared armrest without conscious thought. Lucinda turned another page, revealing a color-coded layout of the very aircraft they were on, each row marked with inspection points. Her finger traced one section before she looked up briefly, her gaze sweeping the cabin with the same calm authority she had shown since boarding. She set the clipboard aside for a moment and reached into her bag once more, this time producing a pair of white gloves folded into a small pouch. She unfolded them slowly, sliding them onto her hands with practiced ease, smoothing the fabric over her fingers until they fit perfectly. Horace's eyes followed every movement, the recognition dawning with each step of the process. Without a word, Lucinda rose from her seat, the gloves now in place, the clipboard tucked under her arm. She stepped into the aisle just as the captain emerged from the cockpit, his uniform crisp, his presence commanding. He paused when he saw her, offering a respectful nod before stepping aside to give her clear passage. The gesture drew the attention of a few nearby passengers, their eyes tracking the interaction with quiet curiosity. Lucinda walked forward, her steps steady despite the gentle sway of the aircraft. She paused at the front of the cabin, speaking briefly with the lead flight attendant, who responded with a quick nod and gestured toward the galley. Horace watched from his seat, a growing awareness of who she truly was replacing the smug certainty he had carried since boarding. Lucinda disappeared behind the partition for a few moments, and when she returned, she moved with an even greater sense of purpose, her clipboard now open to a fresh page where new notes had been added. She inspected the seat rows methodically as she walked back toward her place, her eyes scanning the overhead compartments, the emergency equipment, and the alignment of the seating. When she reached their row, she paused for only the briefest moment to glance at the small holographic inspection label she had placed earlier under the tray table, confirming its position before resuming her seat. The captain had remained at the front of the cabin, but his attention followed her progress, as did the eyes of the lead attendant, who subtly adjusted her movements to give Lucinda a clear line of sight. Once seated, Lucinda removed her gloves with the same care she had put them on, folding them neatly and placing them back into their pouch. She closed the clipboard, latched it, and returned it to the overhead bin, the gold FAA seal catching the light one final time before disappearing from view. The latch clicked shut, final and certain. Horace Minton, now sitting rigidly in his seat, kept his gaze fixed on the seat back in front of him, his earlier arrogance replaced by an involuntary stillness. His arms were crossed, not in dominance, but in something closer to self-containment, as if keeping himself from shrinking visibly into the leather seat. The lead attendant stopped beside their row, her expression polite but edged with a professionalism that made it impossible to mistake the gravity of her presence. She leaned down toward Horace, her voice low, her words unheard by others, but the slight tightening of his jaw betrayed that this was not a casual exchange. Lucinda remained silent, her eyes forward, her posture unchanged, allowing the scene to unfold without acknowledging it directly. Horace glanced sideways at her once, the look brief and uncertain, then back to the attendant, who was now making a note on a small tablet before signaling discreetly to a uniformed airline security officer who had been seated near the rear of first class for the duration of the flight. The officer rose without hurry, moving up the aisle with an even pace, his gaze fixed ahead, his presence drawing only minimal attention in the dim light. As he approached, the lead attendant stepped aside just enough to give him a clear view of Horace. The officer stopped at their row, leaned slightly so his voice would not carry, and addressed Horace directly. Whatever he said made Horace's shoulders stiffen, and though his lips pressed into a thin line, he did not protest loudly enough to disrupt the surrounding calm. The officer produced a folded document from the inside pocket of his jacket and showed it briefly, the top corner revealing the emblem of the airline's corporate security division. Horace looked at it, then at Lucinda, then back again, his face draining of the faint flush it had held moments earlier. The officer spoke again, slower this time, and Horace gave a single curt nod before the officer stepped back but remained standing in the aisle, his posture making it clear that the matter was not over. Lucinda's scarf shifted slightly as she drew a steady breath, not a sigh, but the quiet rhythm of someone who knows events are moving precisely as they should. The rest of the cabin continued largely unaware, some passengers dozing, others watching screens, while a handful cast curious glances toward the small cluster of movement in row 3. The lead attendant retrieved something from the galley, an unmarked envelope that she handed to Lucinda with a faint bow of her head, the gesture one of respect rather than service. Lucinda accepted it with both hands, placing it neatly into her personal bag without breaking her forward gaze. Horace's hands were now clasped tightly in his lap, his fingers intertwined in a way that suggested he was holding back more than words. The officer remained nearby, occasionally glancing toward the cockpit as though awaiting further instruction. 10 minutes later, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the initial descent into their destination. His tone was steady and cordial, but those who had been watching closely could hear a subtle undercurrent of authority that matched the quiet gravity in first class. The officer stepped aside to let the attendants begin securing the cabin for landing, but he never moved far from Horace's row. As the descent continued, Lucinda took out her notebook once more, opening it to a fresh page and writing with the same calm, deliberate strokes she had used earlier. She did not look at Horace, did not make any overt display, but each line she wrote seemed to tighten the invisible net that had been forming around him since the moment she had opened her inspection case. Horace sat motionless except for the occasional twitch of his jaw, his eyes fixed on the headrest ahead as if it were the only safe place to focus. When the cabin lights brightened slightly for landing, the officer moved closer again, speaking quietly to Horace before leaning toward the attendant and making a final note on her tablet. The attendant nodded, then stepped away to resume her duties. The landing was smooth, the tires meeting the runway, with a muted thump as the engines roared in reverse thrust, slowing the massive aircraft down the long stretch of tarmac until the cabin filled with the gentle sway of final taxi. Overhead bins rattled faintly with the change in motion, but in row 3, the air was so still between Horace Minton and Lucinda Braxton that the shift in speed felt almost secondary. Horace sat rigid, his hands gripping the edges of his knees, his eyes locked forward on the closed curtain at the front of the cabin, as if that strip of fabric could keep what was coming at bay. Lucinda remained exactly as she had been throughout the descent, her scarf perfectly draped, her posture steady, her gaze forward and calm. The officer in the forward galley leaned slightly into the aisle as the aircraft slowed to its gate, his eyes fixed on Horace without any need for words. The captain's voice came over the intercom with a cordial welcome to their destination and a reminder to remain seated until the seatbelt sign was off, the kind of message delivered thousands of times every day. But for Horace, it landed with the weight of inevitability. The chime sounded, passengers shifted, seatbelts clicked open, and the soft rustle of coats and bags filled the air. Horace did not move, not because he wanted to obey the instructions, but because the officer had stepped into the aisle beside his row, effectively blocking his exit until the cabin ahead was nearly empty. Lucinda reached up to retrieve her personal bag from under the seat, her movements unhurried and deliberate, as though she were gathering the final details of a completed task. She stood smoothly, stepping into the aisle without glancing at Horace, and the lead attendant moved instinctively to let her pass. Several rows ahead, passengers who had caught glimpses of her earlier interactions with the crew now looked at her with a kind of quiet recognition, though none spoke. She walked forward, pausing briefly to exchange a nod with the captain before stepping through the open cabin door and into the jet bridge, her stride measured, her presence carrying with it a gravity that lingered in her absence. Behind her, the officer finally addressed Horace in a voice that was low enough not to carry beyond their row, gesturing toward the aisle in a way that made it clear his cooperation was not optional. Horace stood, the earlier swagger stripped from his movements, his gaze lowered as he followed the officer toward the front. The remaining passengers pretended not to watch, but their eyes followed discreetly, the unspoken curiosity binding them in silent observation. At the threshold of the aircraft, 2 additional uniformed personnel waited, their stances professional, their attention focused entirely on Horace. A brief exchange of identification and signatures passed between them and the onboard officer, and then Horace was escorted into the jet bridge with a grip on his elbow that brooked no argument. Lucinda, already partway down the terminal, did not turn back. She moved with the quiet assurance of someone who had completed her role without the need for acknowledgement, her destination known only to her and her agency. In the terminal, Horace was led past the gate counter and toward a side corridor where the standard flow of disembarking passengers could not see. His protests were minimal, clipped, and quickly silenced by the presence of the additional officers who met them there. Whatever was said in that space was private, but the outcome was not in doubt. Within the hour, his name would be logged in the airline's internal security database, the details of his behavior cross-referenced with the FAA's incident reporting system, and his privileges as a passenger on multiple carriers effectively suspended pending further review. The procedural language in the reports would be unemotional, just the facts. repeated interference with another passenger's comfort and space, non-compliance with crew instructions, and conduct unbecoming of a passenger in a secure cabin environment. There would be no mention of the smirk he had worn at boarding, no record of the silent jabs and calculated encroachments, but those details would live on in the memory of the one person who had endured them, and in the quiet respect of the crew who had watched her reclaim the space he had tried to take. Outside the terminal windows, the aircraft that had carried them here was already being prepped for its next departure, its movements efficient and impersonal, as if the events of the flight were just another small story in the endless cycle of departures and arrivals. But for Horace, the story would not end at the gate. Letters would arrive in the following days, some from the airline, others from agencies with seals that commanded attention. They would inform him of his ban from certain routes, of investigations into his conduct, of the possibility of further penalties if he attempted to circumvent the restrictions. And for Lucinda, the story would be folded into the countless others she had witnessed and addressed in her role. One more entry in the ledger of quiet justice carried out without spectacle. The end. If you've been following this story to the very end, you know how quickly the balance can shift when someone underestimates the wrong person. If you enjoyed the tension, the slow burn, and that final turn of justice, make sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I want to hear from you. What did you think about Horace's downfall and Lucinda's calm control? Where are you watching from today? Drop your thoughts in the comments and let's talk about it.